So as we heard, there are different priorities for both candidates when it comes to taxation. Now, for more on this, I'm joined by Joe Minarik. He's the Senior Vice President and Director of Research at the think tank Committee for Economic Development. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with some of these very high-profile tax disputes involving American tech companies. We have Apple, Google, and Amazon also. What are some of the latest developments?
Well, interestingly enough, of course, it's not just tech companies. And so even the Gap, Starbucks, IKEA have been fingered on some of these issues. What we have going on now is efforts on the part of, for example, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, to come up with guidelines, action steps that they believe would try to address these issues. And of course, it does become a campaign talking point as well.
Now, a lot of these companies, there's obviously going to be a huge impact, especially some of the reforms that the OECD is proposing. Who are really going to be the big winners and losers then in terms of the countries and the companies?
Well, in terms of companies, those who obviously are taking advantage of ways to game the current system would lose them if the OECD steps turned out to be successful. And this is a very, very complicated area. Countries, there are, of course, the British Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, are very successful at attracting the location of profits that have nothing to do with economic activity. If you could somehow recreate the bind between the locus of economic activity and the location of the profits that then would be taxable, many of these tax havens would lose a lot of mad money. It's not that they were spending tremendous governmental resources to house patents, as an example, but they would lose a source of revenue that currently is really just mad money.
Now, I mentioned Apple, especially since it was labeled with such a huge fine. It could certainly be a warning for other companies. So if these companies are found to be at fault, what could some of the potential fallout be?
Well, one of the things that is most striking to me is the way these companies really are caught between possible reputational risk on the one hand and a race to the bottom on the other hand. If you're a corporate manager and other firms have demonstrated the ability to reduce their tax liabilities by manipulating the location of their intellectual property, by moving funds between one subsidiary and another in different forms that are tax deductible in a high rate country and taxable in a low rate country, your board and your shareholders are going to ask you why you can't do the same thing.
Right.
Now, if you do that, and you are exposed, here we have a company like Starbucks, and even Apple Computer to some extent, which have tried to portray themselves as good citizens, friends of the environment, Starbucks buying renewable sources of coffee beans, and then the next thing you know, you have people parading on the streets, demonstrating against them as being tax dodgers. That's not pretty in terms of the image that they're trying to portray. But you have this race to the bottom, and managers are held responsible for trying to reduce their taxes.
Now, one thing that's interesting, we're seeing a lot of Wall Street and Silicon Valley really moving towards lobbying, especially in this 2016 election cycle. In fact, according to the Center for Responsive Politics, Alphabet, the parent company of Google, has spent more than any other tech company lobbying during this election cycle. How much weight do you think that actually carries then when it comes to the candidates?
We have a system which I think we have to change with respect to campaign finance. Candidates don't like it. It raises all sorts of problems of appearance, if not substance. We really need to deal with that, but we also have to deal with the substance of these issues. And the firms can take a long-term view or they can take a short-term view. The short-term view for many firms, you're arguing for some kind of a preferential rate so that you can take stranded profits overseas and bring them back at a low tax burden. But then on a long-term basis, you really would like to have predictability, and you'd like to have a system that is not subject to the winds of technological change in moving assets from one country to another, adventurous attorneys who come up with new ways and again put the firms at reputational risk.
Now, Joe, just quickly, if you had to decide for Wall Street, for Silicon Valley, which of the two candidates are they really putting their support behind? Is there one that's really trumping the other?
I would really have to guess that taxation is one attribute that they're looking at, but they're probably looking at others as well. And if you look at the captains of industry and where they are, they're on both sides. Not necessarily, I would hope not because of their personal interests, but rather because of their institutional interests.
Right. Well, we'll just have to see where the chips fall. Thank you so much for joining us. Joe Minarik, Senior Vice President and Director of Research at the Committee for Economic Development.